From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Welcome, everybody. I'm Mark Demunation. I'm Chief of the Rare Book and Special Collections Division at the Library of Congress. I'm very pleased to see such a large turnout for the special Thomas Jefferson Library program here at the National Book Festival. If our tabletop conversation earlier this morning is any indication, you're in for a real treat with Professor Ellis. For several decades now, writer, historian, and educator Joseph J. Ellis has pondered the mind of Thomas Jefferson and the universe of ideas that surround him. Ellis's work has been firmly rooted in the American Revolution, the events, the personalities, and the ideas that prompted Americans to ultimately call for independency and declare war on the greatest power in the history of the world. He has created finely sketched portraits of the leaders of the Revolution: Washington, Adams, Hamilton, Jefferson, Franklin, Madison, Burr, and as such, he considers the important historical resonance that each of these characters carry in our nation's story, but he's careful not to gloss over their failings. These are great individuals who have made mistakes. As an educator, he carries these narratives to classes from West Point to Mount Holyoke College to UMass Amherst. As a writer, he has garnered numerous awards. The Passionate Sage, The Character and Legacy of John Adams, was nominated for a Pulitzer in 1993. American Sphinx, The Character of Thomas Jefferson, won the National Book Award in 1997. And Founding Brothers, The Revolutionary Generation, won the Pulitzer for History in 2001. He edited the library's Thomas Jefferson Genius of Liberty for the bicentennial of the Library of Congress in 2000, and went on to consider the life of Washington in 2004, The American Creation in 2007, Abigail and John Adams as the First Family in 2010, and in 2013, an engaging narrative account of the origins of the American Revolution in Revolutionary Summer, The Birth of American Independence. His most recent work, The Quartet, Orchestrating the Second American Revolution, is a consideration of the creation, adoption, and implementation of the United States Constitution, appeared this year. The Jefferson we discover in Ellis's American Sphinx is a man of contradictions, concentrating on the key events of Jefferson's public and private life: the writing of the Declaration, his time in Paris, his presidency, and his retreat to his library in Monticello. Ellis unveils the character of Jefferson, but witnesses as well his insecurities and his hesitancies along the way. Today, Professor Ellis will give us a further glimpse into the character and the mind of Thomas Jefferson. Please welcome Joseph J. Ellis.
Thank you for that gracious introduction. What I'd like to do is talk. I don't have a text. I'd like to talk to you for about no more than 15 minutes and leave the rest of the time available for questions. I'll be best in a Q&A. I'm an old teacher, and I'm best when students are asking me questions, and I am reasonably sure that you will ask me things that it will never occur to me to talk about otherwise. The thing I remember most when I first started to work on Jefferson was the impression that I had that he was unlike any other topic that I had ever worked on. In most cases, if you study somebody who's been dead for a long time, it's like working on a cadaver. You don't expect it to start talking to you. With Jefferson, the cadaver got up and started walking around the room. What do I mean by that? Well, I'm working on Jefferson. I've got my desk full of books. It's in Holyoke, Massachusetts, a dying western Massachusetts post-industrial town. And the furnace breaks. And so I call the furnace guy, and the furnace guy comes to the house, and he sees all these books on my desk. They're about Jefferson. And he said, oh, what are you doing? And I said, I'm writing a book about Thomas Jefferson. He says, come on down to the basement, I'll fix your furnace, and I'll tell you all about him. I said, great. And so we go down to the basement, and he's lying on his back fixing my furnace. And he said, now the thing you got to know, Mr. Ellis, is that Jefferson was an evangelical. And I know he was an evangelical because I've been to Mount Monticello, excuse me. I've been to Monticello, and there they got a Jefferson Bible. Okay, and in the Jefferson Bible, it's pretty clear that Jefferson believes in the values of Jesus Christ as we in the evangelical community regard them as sacred and divine. And don't let anybody tell you otherwise. So I'm thinking to myself, do I want to tell this guy that Jefferson not only was not an evangelical, but he really wasn't a Christian? I mean, if you believe that Jesus is the divine Son of God, and he doesn't believe that. And I thought, no, I want my furnace fixed. So I didn't tell him anything. But 2 years later, Encyclopedia Britannica asked me to rewrite the entry on Jefferson in the encyclopedia. It hadn't been redone in almost 30 years. So I added some stuff about a page on Jefferson's view of religion. And there I put in the fact that Jefferson regarded religion as a very private thing. And it was the one thing that was a private right that everybody possessed and the state cannot interfere with, the government. That's the reason he puts Virginia's resolution for religious freedom second on his tombstone. But that he thought that Jesus was like Socrates, a kind of neat guy, not the Son of God. And that if you had to use a single word to describe Jefferson's mature religious convictions, it would be that he was a deist. He believed there was a God, but that he existed far off and had nothing to do with the world as on a day-by-day basis. I was informed by Encyclopedia Britannica that they received more complaints about that issue of Jefferson than any other biographical entry they had ever printed. That these people out there are organized and they believe what they believe, and God bless them. All right, I'll give you a second example of what I'm talking about. And it's part of Jefferson's there's an electromagnetic field around Jefferson, okay? And you walk into that field and things happen like this. I'm on a book tour for American Sphinx. And American Sphinx is doing a lot better than anybody believes. It's selling copies, you know? And so they send me all over. They send me to like 27 cities. And one of the cities I go to is Richmond. Anybody from Richmond here? Richmond is further south than Mobile in some respects. There are places in Richmond that are in Latin America. So I did this talk about Jefferson, standard talk. And the thrust of my interpretation is Jefferson is a very complicated human being. And that he has a capacity for, well, he's promiscuous. He can appeal to a variety of different kind of people who otherwise don't agree about anything. So it's not, this was all pre-Sally Hemings too, okay? So I give this talk, and It's not, now the people that are burning incense to Jefferson down in Charlottesville, they're not going to like this talk, okay? But it really wasn't a bad, I wasn't taking him on and saying, excuse me, we should tear down the Jefferson Memorial or anything like that. This little old lady gets up, very sartorially well turned out, and she gets up and at the Q&A, and she says, Mr. Ellis, I won't be able to do her accent justice. Mr. Ellis, I knew you were going to say bad things about Mr. Jefferson because he came to me in my bedroom last night. And he told me that you were going to spread lies about him. And Mr. Ellis, and this was the clincher, Mr. Ellis, you are a mere pigeon on the great statue of Thomas Jefferson. Now you can imagine the cogency of my comments. Ba-da-ba-da-ba-doo-ba-ba-dee-ba. But she came up to get her book signed. Whoops. And she's got a card with her. It said, give her a name. It said, poet. She said she was going to write a poem about me. It was going to be about the clay feet of Joseph Ellis or something like that. So, but when she came up, I had had time to think about what I really wanted to say. And I said, Madam, it's not important whether or not you regard me as a pigeon, but it is really important that you know that Thomas Jefferson was not a statue. The thing that most struck me when I started work on American Sphinx that became in some ways the original impulse behind what, when you're a historian or a biographer, the Jefferson Papers is a big thing, and so you got to read them all, obviously, and I did, but what are you really looking for? And I was looking for somebody who was able to play hide and seek inside himself. And I was looking for somebody who, as I think I put it, had the deep duplicity of the pure of heart. Like he really believed, like he could tell Adams, no, I didn't libel you, I didn't pay Callender. He paid him. But when he's talking to Adams, he's really telling you the truth because the truth shifts in his mind. When he says to George Washington, like I didn't write these things saying that you were senile, but he did write them. But when he speaks to Washington, he's somehow. Now, this is the reason why John Meacham has a point, and he's going to appear later, that Jefferson had the makings of a great modern politician. He could lie with great confidence. But he believed his own lies in a way that's really difficult. But the reason, here's what I'm talking about too. It's like in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, Abraham Lincoln, Stephen Douglas, both Lincoln and Douglas believe Jefferson agrees with them. When the South secedes from the Union in 1861, both the Confederacy and Lincoln and the Union believe that Jefferson is on their side. When Herbert Hoover runs against Franklin Delano Roosevelt for the presidency of the United States in 1932, both of them think they are Jeffersonians. When Ronald Reagan is elected president, he, in his inaugural address, says we must pluck a rose from Jefferson's garden and wear it in our lapels forever. And William Jefferson Clinton starts his inaugural parade in Monticello. He is America's everyman. He's all things to all people. And the question I get is, I was trying to answer in the book, is it's not just any man who can be every man. How do you do that? Well, I was asking that question in a context in which the dominant point of view was established by Franklin Roosevelt in 1943. I was born in this city in 1943. My father worked for the Secret Service. My mother was a nightclub singer in Baltimore. And Franklin Roosevelt rode out of the White House. The limo went to the National Archives, and he picked up the portable desk that Jefferson allegedly used to write the first draft of the Declaration. It was a desk custom made for him by a former slave, where in the third week of June of 1776, at the second floor apartment of 7th and Market Street, he wrote the magic words of American history. And they are the magic words of American history. These 55 words are the most important words in American and maybe in modern world history. If you're looking for a secret to the wellspring, this is it. These words mean so much and different things to different people. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving from the consent of the government, deriving their justification. I get it wrong. Every time I get it wrong. This is like a Catholic student reciting his catechisms, okay? And I went to Gonzaga and they taught me about the catechisms. But it is, like, think about this, like when Ho Chi Minh wrote the Constitution for Vietnam in 1946. How does it begin? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Now, later on it says, workers of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your chance. So it's a nice blend of Jefferson and Marx, And when the women gathered together at Seneca Falls in 1848, how did they begin? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. I think Jefferson meant men and women, don't you? Yes. What he really meant was that all of us that are human beings possess a soul. And that separates us from other creatures as human beings. That's what I think. Of course, you can get a lot of people with different opinions on that. Anyway, it's Jefferson's promiscuity, his ability, whether you're pro-life or pro-abortion, whether you want to limit immigration or you want to seek amnesty, whether you want to invade the Middle East or you want to keep out, I swear you'll find somebody who's going to want Jefferson, claim Jefferson on his side. And if American history were a casino, nobody that's bet on Jefferson, as far as I can tell, has ever lost. You want him. He's like an ace in the hole. You want him, right? Until now. Maybe you don't want him. The Democratic Party is not so sure. The Democratic Party in Ohio, as well as several other states, have just said that they're going to drop Jefferson's name from the annual Jefferson-Jackson dinner. Going to drop Jackson's name, too. Jackson did the Indians bad, and Jefferson did the black man bad. Now, I don't see anybody with any stonemasons up there ready to knock Jefferson's image off Mount Rushmore, but there are people that have actually written books calling for the Jefferson Memorial to be replaced by a memorial to Frederick Douglass. And like, if you are a historian and you want to get a PhD, and like I had a wonderful student named Chandra, I won't tell you her last name, at Mount Holyoke, and she wrote a great thesis with me, the title of which was The Poetry of Revolution, Jefferson, Lincoln, and W.B. Yeats. She now is a full professor at Georgetown. She went to Harvard, and she said, I want to write about Jefferson. They said, what? You can't do that. He's the dead wettest male you can possibly imagine. You finish your career you're finished if you do that. And that's, like. So within the profession, there is a set of assumptions which in some form are perfectly sensible assumptions. Namely, we ought to spend our time recovering the voices of the forgotten people. Jefferson is hardly forgotten. Let's focus on, people who are the silent. African Americans, Native Americans, women. Okay, but it's pushed beyond that, and a lot of people are playing their politics on the past. A lot of politically correct nonsense. People are doing their political isometric exercises against Thomas Jefferson. And I don't think that's a good idea. And I want to conclude with trying to make the point I want to end with in terms of the occasion for this moment. It's 1815, and Thomas Jefferson agrees to sell his books. I thought there were 10,000, but it's a little less than that, books, to what becomes the Library of Congress for $23,950. Now, he doesn't give them away. Now, I'm told he could have probably got more money if he looked elsewhere, but he needs the money. Now, there are two ways to tell this story, okay? And this is really interesting. Here is the way, on this occasion, you should tell it. Jefferson loved books. He really loved books. And that when he retired, first retirement in 1793-94, he says, I'm retiring to my family, my farm, and my books. And if you love the book and you believe it's imperiled, Jefferson is a guy you want to have on your side. He makes this contribution, and the seeds that he plants become the greatest library in the world. Hey, it is the greatest library in the world. Now, he doesn't really know what he's doing when he does it, but he's happy, he thinks maybe. And like, even when he sells these books, but he wants books around him so bad that he goes and buys about another 1,000 books. By the way, he is broke. He is the modern equivalent of between $7 and $10 million in debt in 1815. But he goes and buys more books. And I remember running into a guy who said, like, I saw some of Jefferson's books, like I saw Montesquieu's L'Esprit Le Roi, Spirit of the Laws, the original edition, and the pages weren't cut, meaning he didn't really read it. I said, he read it. He gave the copy he read to what became the Library of Congress, and he just bought other copies because he wanted to have these things around him without reading them, just part of the space that he occupied. So that's a good story, especially if you're like me and you worry about the book and you think you're an anachronism for reading books that are actually books. This is good news, okay? Now, you could go the other way, however. Why is Jefferson selling these books in the first place? Because he is in debt. Now, there are two modern miracles. One is Einstein's theory of relativity, and the other is compound interest. And Jefferson understood neither of those things. And he inherits the debt from his father-in-law that he never pays back. He could have in depreciated currency during the war, blah, 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 blah. Anyway, when he dies, he is going to be about $10 million in debt. Now, here's the thought, which I suggested we mention. People wanted him to free his slaves, right? He owned about 200 slaves, 100 of them in Monticello, another in another plantation down the road, 90 miles. Jefferson didn't own his slaves. His creditors owned his slaves. He couldn't sell them. He couldn't give them away. He couldn't free them. I'm not sure he knew that. I mean, he knew he was broke. But he frees 5 slaves in his will before he dies. They're all Hemingses, related to the extended Hemings family. But in the 6 months after the ghouls descend upon Monticello, it's dismembered of all the furnishings, and 130 African Americans whom he is promised will not be sold down the river are sold down the river. And that's not just a euphemism. If you get sold to Mississippi or Louisiana, you're in deep trouble. Your lifespan is very short. And there were promises he made that he couldn't keep. So that's the other way to tell the story, that the gift is itself an indication of his bankruptcy, and then you could say his moral bankruptcy and his inability to take a strong stand against slavery in his latter years. Here's where I want to leave you, and I hope this prompts some questions. We need Jefferson because, not in spite of, but because of his imperfections. He is the most resonant symbol of the central contradiction in American history. He is the author of the magic words of American history about human equality, and he is the embodiment of America's original sin with regard to slavery. He is both things. That's America. That's who we've been, and to some extent, who we are. We don't have slavery, but if you think racism's over, well, we know that's not true. That we need imperfect, flawed founders. In fact, if they were gods, if they were perfect, what in heaven's name would we have to learn from them? Jefferson, I think, the imperfect man, and really imperfect, though gloriously so, is a much more interesting subject for our attention. And when we go over to the Jefferson Memorial now, here's what I want you to do. I want you to talk to Jefferson. And I want you to tell him to talk to Martin Luther King. And then you go over to Lincoln Memorial and you talk to Lincoln and you tell him, I want you to talk to Jefferson, and he'll then talk to Martin Luther King. There is an American conversation going on among those 3 heroes, those 3 significant figures, that is the central conversation in American history. Let's leave Jefferson in the conversation. Thank you very much. I think I did what I said. I don't know how much time we've got. How much time we got? 10 or 15 minutes? Okay. I would love to be able to respond to questions. Oh, I see a former student of mine leaping to the microphone here. Watch out for those former students, because they know what I really think. Okay.
So I have to write a paper for Peter Onuf on Jefferson by tomorrow night.
She
Only
has to write a
1,000 words.
paper for this guy, Peter Onuf, who is a distinguished Jefferson scholar at Mr. Jefferson's University, namely the University of Virginia at Charlottesville. Yes.
So what I need to know more about is Jefferson's relations with the Native Americans, saying that, of course...
Jefferson's relationship to Native Americans?
Correct. He wanted, of course, to bring them into the blood of our country, but he was unsuccessful. And would you say he laid the foundation for Andrew Jackson's mistreatment of the Native Americans?
Yes, I'm afraid so. Okay, thank you. Namely, early in his life, and even places like Notes on Virginia, Jefferson has really interesting things to say about Native Americans, in part because in the early 1780s he's responding to Count Buffon, the French scientist who is the leading sort of a Nobel Prize caliber scientist of his day, who has a theory about the North American continent, that all the plants, animals, and people who originate on the North American continent are inferior. And in order to counter that, he cites at length the Native Americans, whom Jefferson believes to be eloquent. He says he listened to this speech once, the greatest piece of eloquence he ever heard from a Native American chief, even though he didn't understand a word the guy was saying. So that there's Jefferson in that phase, but when he gets to be president, the seeds are sown for Indian removal, mainly because he claims the federal government has no jurisdiction to prevent that from happening. The only way it could have happened, the only way if you could have avoided genocide in slow motion, is some kind of action on the federal government's side. And he refuses to do that, and in fact, quite the opposite. He says, you know, like, there's some letters you don't want to hear quoted because they're going to be offensive to you, but he believes that Indian removal east of the Mississippi is inevitable and just. But he also, sort of like Jackson, thinks the only way the Indians, the Native Americans, and most of them now still want to be called Indians, by the way, the only way they can preserve their culture is if we create a reservoir for them out there in the West. And then, see, there's no way to find a reservoir until after the Louisiana Purchase, right? So the Louisiana Purchase is a place that, now we know where we're going to send them. And Jefferson starts what Jackson finishes.
Yeah, Professor Ellis, let's assume your favorite elderly female poet in Richmond is able to do more than get Jefferson back in her bedroom, but actually somehow conjures Jefferson back. He arrives here, he knows what he accomplished. He looks now, election, Donald Trump, Dr. Carson on one side, Hillary Clinton on the other. What goes through his mind, do you think, if he were to come back and say, this is what I started? I mean, what do you think he would say?
All right. Now, I'm going to answer your question. Okay.
I would hope.
But it is a stupid question.
Well, thank you. You've called me stupid before.
The reason that I didn't say you're stupid. I said it's a stupid question.
I understand that.
The reason it's a stupid question is because bringing Jefferson into the present is like trying to plant cut flowers.
True.
And they asked me this, what would Washington do about Iraq? He would say, where the hell is Iraq? Eventually, I satisfied people by saying, he would say, I don't understand, we've become the British.
Yeah.
They get that one. But I think that if any of the founders, to include Jefferson, were to look down upon the electoral politics of America at this moment and the circus that it is, and I'm not mentioning any names like Donald Trump or anything like that, they would say, this is not what we had in mind. And the mess we've made of things up here in the 21st century is truly historic. the likelihood of there being a second constitutional convention it's impossible to imagine that occurring and being successful. What Jefferson has going for him, however, in this context, is a firm conviction, and this is really central to Jefferson's whole way of thinking, that every generation is sovereign. Now, if you think about it, this is a recipe for chaos, okay? This means the Constitution needs to be replaced every 20 to 25 years. And when he says this to Madison, Madison nearly has a heart attack. And then he says, by the way, what do you think a generation is? I mean, do you think they sort of like people that come and go in columns or something? But Jefferson really believed the future is with us, that he didn't want his generation and him to be a burden to us. When Jefferson talked about history, he said, the burden of the past. He's an Enlightenment creature. We've emerged out of the cave. Let's move forward. Science civilization is going to progress in ways that we can never, and back here in the 18th century, know. The whole notion of original intent and doctrine of interpretation of the Constitution, bizarre from his point of view. Okay, be like children trying to wear, grown-ups trying to wear the clothes that they had as children, he says. So that his real comment is, you're on your own and you're really screwing up. That's what I think he'd say.
Thank you.
A professor in Houston named Gerald Horne is arguing that the purpose of the American Revolution was the same as the purpose of the South seceding from the North later, that the abolitionism was gaining ground throughout the English-speaking world, and the 13 colonies seceded from the British Empire in order to preserve the institution of slavery. And then they had to do it all over again.
Oh, that's wrong.
Later.
The first part's wrong. The second part's not wrong. It's arguable. The colonies didn't secede from the British Empire to protect slavery, by any stretch. The colonies seceded from the British Empire in order to preserve their individual rights as colonies. By the way, they didn't secede as a union. They seceded. The Resolution for Independence, drafted by Richard Henry Lee in June of '76 and voted on July 2nd, reads that these colonies are and have every right to be independent states. We don't secede as a union. We secede as a confederation of states. Where the professor from Houston has a legitimate historical point is that the South had a legitimate political point in claiming that in seceding from the Union in 1861, they were doing the same thing as the colonies were doing in 1776. Okay? Now, that's a good argument because it also protects you from the charge that the real motive is slavery. And it is the real motive. But the political cover for it is we want to be free of the tyrannical intrusions of the Lincoln government in the same way that our forefathers were free from the tyrannical actions of George III. And they have a constitutional argument there to make. They do. I'm a Southerner by birth. Yes, sir.
Jefferson has influenced everybody, every party, everybody claims him.
Yeah.
Who would he claim is most influential to him?
Who would Jefferson think was most influential for him? He had a tutor at William and Mary he thought was really influential called William Small. When he was coming up as a politician, well, he didn't use the word politician, as a political leader in Virginia, there were a couple of people that he looked on, but one of them was not Patrick Henry. When later on he's asked about Henry, he said to Madison, "We must all devoutly pray for his imminent death." I think that John Adams is a kind of initial role model for him, believe it or not, when they meet in Philadelphia at the convention, at the Continental Congress. But then Jefferson basically lives with the Adams family for about 8 months in 1784 in Paris when and remember, Adams is like 9 years older. He's a kind of mentor, and Jefferson just lost his wife, Martha, and he sort of takes on John Quincy as his own. There's real closeness there. Now, we know what's going to happen. That's going to fall apart, but they're going to recover it. But Jefferson is an original. Jefferson is an iconoclastic figure. Jefferson isn't a political thinker. He's a political visionary. The person that most influences him the mature years of his life is Madison. But Madison is his acolyte. It's Madison who's worshiping the ground Jefferson walks on. A lot of things Jefferson says in the 1790s in his presidency is really Madison. Okay, I think we're close to the end. Do we have room?
I think we have time for one more question.
We have time for one more question. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. You said in your earlier talk that the reason we were able, or one of the factors in getting the Constitution was that they had the privacy and the time and the space to argue and debate and come up with the Constitution. And talked a little bit about the role of the media today and how ever-present it is. When you talk about the need for government to change with the times, is there a need now for our government and the way that our government works to change now that the media and this constant access and the constant knowledge of personal foibles and faults?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we're on a 24/7 news cycle, and we're in a place where space doesn't exist in terms of, remember, space is so important back in the 18th century. Distance is really a big thing. It no longer exists. And the politics that we are practicing, we're making it up as we go along now in terms of how we make an adjustment to that technology. I would say that by and large, it's been for the worse. By and large, we know too much. We are overloaded with information, much of it trivial, that the coverage is up close next to the window or the mirror. We're looking at it right like this, and we need to step back. That's a historian's bias. But I think that we found a way for technology to make us proximate, over-informed. I wish we could find a way to allow ourselves to recover some perspective, for journalism to be practiced in ways that permit it to be analytical. But I'm howling into the wind here. I'm maybe an anachronism. That's what I'm saying is that we need to make an adjustment based on the technology, and thus far we have been unable to do so. Thank you very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.